And now to put it all together, since we have a demand curve that slopes down and we have a supply curve that slopes up, they will intersect. And so we'll have a supply curve, a demand curve, and they will intersect. Where they intersect, we're going to call that the equilibrium quantity and the equilibrium price. And so there'll be one price where the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. Any price higher than that, the quantity supplied will be greater than the quantity demanded, and we're going to call that a surplus. So if the price gets too high, producers are going to want to produce more, consumers are going to want to consume less, and we're going to end up with a surplus. The surplus will have the effect of driving down prices, right? In order to sell more of this good, prices are going to fall, and as prices fall, we're going to move down the demand curve to a greater quantity demanded. And then as prices fall, the number of sellers or the producers are going to cut back, and the quantity supplied is going to decrease, and we're going to end up back at the equilibrium quantity and the equilibrium price. Similarly, if the price gets too low, the quantity demanded will exceed the quantity supplied. Similarly, if the price got too low and the quantity demanded exceeded the quantity supplied, we would call that a shortage. And if there's a shortage, meaning more people want to buy the good than is available at that particular price, it's going to have the effect of bidding up the price. As the price bids up, fewer and fewer people are going to want to buy the good. As the price goes up, more and more people are going to be willing to sell the good or produce the good. And again, we're going to end up back at the equilibrium quantity and the equilibrium price. And so the whole idea of this increasing supply curve and decreasing demand curve, so we're going to end up at an equilibrium price where the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded, and there is no surplus and there's no shortage, and there's a mechanism in place that if prices get out of whack, that they'll move back to that equilibrium quantity and equilibrium price. And of course, that equilibrium quantity and equilibrium price doesn't necessarily stay where it is. Let's say there is a change in tastes and our good becomes more popular. Well, we're going to say that that's going to be an increase in the demand curve, right? A change in tastes will shift the demand curve. This will move us to a higher quantity demanded, and it will move up the supply curve. We're going to move up the supply curve to higher quantity supplied as the demand curve has shifted to the right. So an increase in demand leads to a higher price and a higher quantity. A decrease in demand will have the opposite effect, lead to a lower price and a lower quantity. Or if something happens to shift the supply curve, say there's an increase in input prices, an increase in input prices will shift the supply curve to the left, and then we will move to a smaller quantity as we move up the demand curve to a smaller quantity and to a higher price. So an increase in input prices will have the effect of increasing the price of the good we're selling and decreasing the quantity. If there's, on the other hand, a change in technology, for example, that makes it possible to produce more of the good, we'll shift the supply curve to the right. Remember, a change in technology will shift the supply curve. It'll shift the supply curve to the right. And at that point, we would end up with a greater quantity and a lower price because we're moving down the demand curve to a lower price. So if the supply curve shifts to the left, quantity will go down, price will go up. If the supply curve shifts to the right, quantity will go up and price will go down. The demand curve, if the demand curve shifts to the right, price goes up, quantity goes up. If the demand curve shifts to the left, price goes down, quantity goes down. And of course, it's always possible that two things could happen at the same time. For example, the technology could shift the supply curve to the right, and at the same time, a change in tastes could shift the demand curve to the right. Well, both of those have the effect of increasing quantity. So if the supply curve shifts to the right and the demand curve shifts to the right, we know that the quantity is going to increase. However, the supply curve shifting to the right has the effect of lowering prices. The demand curve shifting to the right has the effect of raising prices. So we don't know. If all we know is that the supply curve shifted to the right and the demand curve shifted to the right, we know quantity went up, but we don't know what happened to price. And there's a chart on, or table, excuse me, on page slide number 55, slide number 55, which will show you that if two curves move at the same time, we always know one thing, depending on which curves, and we know if it's both curves move. One is the supply curve that moved and one is the demand curve that moved. But depending on the direction that each curve moved, we always know one thing, either the quantity or the price, and then the other one is uncertain, and we would need to know by how much each moved, and that will be a subject for a future lecture, to figuring out the how much part. Next idea, and the last set of big ideas for this particular evening, have to do with what we call consumer surplus and producer surplus. So the demand curve is based on the willingness to pay. It's a representation of how much people want a particular good, and it tells us exactly how much they would be willing to buy of a particular good at a given price. But because the demand curve slopes down, because the demand curve slopes down, because the demand curve slopes down, and we know there's one particular price. I'm not going to draw the supply curve in. I'm just going to recognize there's a supply curve somewhere that leads to this particular price. So this is the quantity, and this is the price. Let's just call it, for the sake of an example, let's call it $10. So at this particular price of $10, this many goods are demanded. This many people are willing to buy the good. But we can see by just looking at this demand curve that if the price rose, let's say to $15, there would still be some people that would be willing to pay. And so all of these people who are willing to pay 15, of course, they only have to pay 10. Everybody pays the same price. There's only one price in this particular model. When we do supply, demand, equilibrium price, everyone pays the same price. So even the people who are willing to pay $15, they only had to pay 10. And we're going to call the difference between their willingness to pay and what they actually had to pay, we call that consumer surplus. It's a way to quantify what we call the gains from trade. Right? Remember, there are gains from trade. And one of the reasons there are gains from trade is that you're able to buy something for less than you'd be willing to. Like if the price went up, you'd still buy it. Now, not everybody would buy it, right? If the price goes up, fewer people are going to buy, but some would still buy. And so we know those people are out there. We know those preferences are out there. That demand is out there. But they all only have to pay $10. And so this area under the demand curve above the price, we're going to call that consumer surplus. That's just the word we're going to use to describe the difference between the willingness to pay and what you actually have to pay. And it's the area of a triangle. There's a little equation that you could think about. If you remember, the area of a triangle is half the base times the height. Well, the base of this triangle is always the quantity. And then the height is the difference between the intercept, and let's maybe call this 25, and the price. So half the quantity times the intercept minus the price is the equation for the consumer surplus. And similarly, if there's a supply curve of any kind, now I will draw it in. The area above the supply curve, below the price, we're going to call that producer surplus. And later on in the course, we'll also refer to that as profit, because we're going to learn in great detail that the supply curve really comes out of costs, including opportunity costs. But getting ahead of myself here, let's just say that the supply curve is right where it is. And it represents the willingness to sell, right? Remember, at any given price, the supply curve tells us how much the producer would be willing to produce and sell at that particular price. And since the price is higher than here, and we know that somebody would be willing to sell some here, but they get to charge the full $10, or get paid the full $10, the difference between their willingness to sell and what they actually have to sell it for, or what they can sell it for, we're going to call that producer surplus. And the great thing about this equilibrium, this place where there's no surplus and no shortage, is that it maximizes the total surplus. We're going to call this the total welfare of the trade. That we are maximizing the welfare of the consumers, maximizing the difference between the willingness to pay and what they actually pay, and we're maximizing the welfare of the producers. And that any other quantity price combination is going to lead to a reduction in total surplus. You could think of a higher price where some producers are able to make more money and their producer surplus increases, but it would all be at the cost of a reduction in consumer surplus. And in fact, the reduction in consumer surplus would be greater than the increase in producer surplus. So the way to maximize total surplus, meaning the sum of producer surplus and consumer surplus, is to have the price be at the equilibrium price where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. We're going to call that outcome efficient. Remember, efficient is a place where it's not possible to make one person better off than it is without making somebody else worse off. Not saying we can't make the producers better off. We could by hurting consumers, or perhaps we could come up with a price ceiling that's a little lower and make some consumers better off, but it would all be at the expense of producers. But this maximization of consumer and producer surplus, we're going to call that outcome efficient. It ensures that every potential buyer values the purchase more than any buyer that doesn't purchase the good. It means that every seller is willing to sell for less than every seller who's not willing to sell. So it allocates the trades to those who want to buy the good the most and those who are most willing to sell. It leads to the maximum possible quantity. So we're going to call this the efficient outcome. A couple of things are required for this outcome to be successful. One is there has to be well-established property rights, that if I'm making something and I'm going to sell it, I really do own it. And then once the person buys it from me, they really own it after they bought it. That there's so we do need some sort of government structure over all of this to ensure property rights. It's also important that everybody kind of know what the price is. And this is probably the most where the ideal of the perfect market kind of breaks down a little bit, is there's this assumption of perfect information. It's actually less of an assumption than it used to be, because the internet has really made it more and more possible for consumers and producers as well to understand what's really happening in any particular market. The auto market, and there's been a lot of advertising lately around some of these apps where you can get the true price, because the auto market used to be very mysterious and consumers would go into auto dealers and not really sure what was going on. The internet has really reduced some of that uncertainty, so that prices really only act as a signal in terms of both consumption and production if everybody kind of knows what the price is. As I said, things have gotten better in that regard in recent years. And then having a stable government, which we've had in the United States now for a long time, to establish property rights, allows this whole thing to function. So that's the last thing I want to say for tonight. I will be posting, I've already posted homework 1, as you know. I will be posting homework 2. Both homeworks 1 and 2 will be due on September 11th, the beginning of class. I will be having office hours on September 10th. Starting at 6 o'clock. I could probably get there a little bit earlier if requested, so I don't want to rush and get there early if there's no one going to be waiting for me. But if you wanted to start office hours a few minutes earlier, and you were definitely going to be there, do send me an email or a text message, and I will do my best to get there before 6. But I'll definitely be there by 6. No appointment necessary at 6. And I look forward to seeing you then, and definitely look forward to seeing you in class. And look forward to you emailing me if you have any questions. All right, thank you.